Poštovani gledatelji UNIDU televizije, ali također i naši dragi slušatelji UNIDU radija, u još jednoj smo epizodi podcasta DU-CHECK gdje razgovaramo sa profesorima, znanstvenicima, uglednim ljudima iz svijeta medija, politologije, odnosa s javnošću i svega onoga što se tiče oko nas na društvenim mrežama. Danas naš gost dolazi iz Norveške, to je profesor Oddgeir Tveiten. Thank you for coming. It is very nice to have you here.
Thank you for inviting. I appreciate it.
We have a lot of themes in common that we can talk about, and this whole series of DU-CHECK podcast, videocast, that we are talking with professors and other people from the whole media industry and political communication and social networks and everything in connection. We have a lot of specific themes that we can talk about, but when we are talking about the technology, something that we spoke about a little bit early before the camera started to record was the difference that we have in media from Europe to United States of America, to Africa, to all across the universe. And the whole globalization made us connected, but still it's very different. So you have a lot of experience and we can go maybe from there. So if you can tell us more about your work time in those countries, like on the University of Stanford in Silicon Valley and in Africa and everything that's connected.
Okay. So I guess there is a short version, there's a long version, but we'll go with the short version, I think.
Of course.
I had a chance to do my graduate studies in the United States, and I did that at the University of Minnesota, where I also lived as a child, because my family has a long-term, sort of several generations old relationship to the United States. So in some ways, I think I could say that I'm familiar with the media setting, the media institutions, journalism, education, at least in parts of the United States. I have a master's degree in journalism. I have a PhD in international communication. Many years later, I moved back, and this time to California. So as you mentioned, I have been for several years sort of privy to developments at a time where developments actually accelerated at a steadily faster pace, if you will. One of those times was right before the so-called massive open online courses, the MOOCs movement, if you might call it a movement, say 2012, 2013. The other time was a few years after that. But I think what you saw at that time was kind of the consequences of how the internet, after having sort of matured for a number of years, and the World Wide Web as we know it had sort of on the one hand generated sort of media sort of web browsers like Mosaic and so on. We had gotten accustomed to using email. We had seen the development of social media like Facebook based on earlier sort of versions or iterations, Friendster, MySpace, these kinds of things. Then Twitter came along and Google started to develop and make itself known on a range of different levels. And by the time we reached 2012, 2013, I think the main story here is that within the education sphere, these developments are starting to be felt in ways that became kind of like an international concern with the future of universities as higher education institutions, because so much is now enabled through technology. So I think that's kind of the first thing here, that technologies enable in constantly new ways. And as we know, it has affected higher education dramatically over the last few years. And with the next generation now of generative AI, it's likely to transform even at a deeper level. If you look back a few years to the 1990s, you saw a rather deep cutting change, for instance, in the music industry with Napster and other media kind of rearranging or redefining the entire economic base of the music industry. You've seen how the film industry has changed on account of streaming, for instance, and how completely new formats have come up, you know, like series, so-called binge series, you know, where it changes the way we kind of connect with films, with television and with movies in many different ways. I think you see the same in practically all walks of life, that technologies are now intersecting in ways that we may have somehow forecasted, but also in unanticipated ways. And one of those key discussions we have, I think, at this point in my home country, which is Norway, is the impacts or the effects of this media abundance, for instance, on young people. And so to cut it short, I think we're living through a very, very sort of questionable, if you will, a gigantic experiment that we aren't quite aware of how these things will sort of in the long run impact on us. But we are seeing, for instance, that our reading habits are changing, our attention span is changing, our way of connecting with people around the world is changing, and much of that is good, but it is changing. And I think also we have a future discussion coming in how these technologies will sort of marginalize older people, because they happen too fast for many to kind of keep up with. So for me, this has kind of changed from a journalism concern that I had when I started out to a much more sort of society-wide concern with how we in general approach these questions of technology. And I think we're just at the beginning of some rather profound discussions here. And coming back to your original question, I would say that much of the technology innovation has happened in the United States. Not all of it, but much of it. I think one sort of key thing to remember here is that if it were not from semiconductors from Taiwan and Korea, we wouldn't have the technology in California. If it weren't for the sort of the technical sort of developments in other parts of the world, you wouldn't have the design sort of qualities that you have in California. But the thinking, the innovation, the push, the drive for these things kind of belong there. And if you take Silicon Valley, it's about 50 kilometers from south to north. It's kind of San Jose to San Francisco. That's a very small distance. But then if you look at the condensation of global companies that are actually present there, I think you can see a force that is huge. And it has reaches into practically every corner of the world. That's kind of what took me there, and that's also, I have to say, one of the worries, because I think we might say that the commercial nature of these things, the definitions of information, free flow of information as sort of being market-based, is not necessarily how we would define the virtues and the values of information flows in Europe. I think we have a different culture in a sense. And I think also you're seeing that the European Union is one of the few institutions that's capable of standing up, for instance, to Meta, including Facebook and Google, and is actually doing so. So I think in the future what we're looking at also is a kind of a response to this open sort of Wild West period we have behind us, with attempts to order, to regulate, to define what needs to be regulated and what doesn't necessarily need to be regulated, the institutions of regulation, and I think also in the European context, a sense of like a common unity, like a market, if you will, or political unity that we don't at this point really have, because we are nation states. And we have a whole bunch of laws and rules that are nation-state specific, but we have a European-wide and a global-wide communication policy that we need.
When I'm listening to you, there are a lot of themes that we can go in this direction or this direction, but for me it's something that is very close, and the people that are watching the podcast, most of them know that my whole life is very connected with the music and music production and the whole audio world more than the TV. And that's when you told about the Napster. That reminded me how when the Lars Ulrich from the Metallica, the drummer, but the good businessman, one of the best ones in the whole rock and roll industry, he's one of the most responsible people behind the Metallica as a big brand in the music world. But still, when the Napster came out, I can remember that I, as a child, and my cousins, my friends, we were so inspired by it. We can download some music, and it was, for me, I think it was early 2000 to 2001. And then I can remember that the first media articles came out that Lars Ulrich came as a Grinch and he wanted to stop the Napster. But he was so in front of everybody else that he saw what are the dangerous places that came later with Spotify, Tidal, Deezer, everything. Because today the whole economics of the music industry changed. Did you see some similar examples in the world of movies or something? Because I think the Netflix, the HBO and the other big streaming services also became a danger for the movie industry.
Yeah, okay. So you didn't tell me before we started that you had this music interest. So let's stick with the music for a second.
Yeah, of course.
Last week, one of the reasons I'm here, last week we had a conference and our 2-day workshop where, among other things, the music ecosystem and how it's being affected by artificial intelligence was one of those key issues and terms. I'm part of a research group that has, I think, a rather profound international network when it comes to the music industry. So I'm intrigued by that kind of a connection. And especially if you're a fan of Lars Ulrich and Metallica. Are you?
Yeah, I was at one concert, but when I was in my early childhood ages and my high school years, I listened a lot of Metallica, but today I'm in more other direction, and I don't have so much time to listen for music. I would like to, but the life is happening.
Yeah, they don't have as much time to play anymore either.
Yeah.
Lars Ulrich, of course, lives right north of San Francisco, across the Golden Gate Bridge, and I think basically is collecting art and doing other things much of the time these days. But anyway, the reason I'm asking is that anybody who's been to a Metallica concert, or for that matter, any large sort of arena concert, and I've been to a Metallica concert in San Jose at a particular time when I was living there, that kind of serves as an apt illustration here. Just think about what it means to be in a stadium with all that energy, with all those people, and with the sound level, the noise level, if you will, the excitement that comes into that. That's one thing with the music industry that's very different, for instance, from journalism studies or from media, film, television studies, when we talk about sort of the implications here of sort of the economic situations having changed. They have changed in some rather comparable ways. But what's not comparable is this culture of listening to music, of fandom, of having a relation to particular musicians or bands, and then meeting them live. That's a particular thing. So the first reminder, I think, is to think of these various spheres or ecosystems as having some of the same problems, but also being distinctly different. And from that point of view, I think if you go back to sort of the early times with Napster or Pirate Bay or whoever you want to point to, the first thing to note is that the way we could at a certain point download, and actually did, you know, in the sense that, oh wow, all of a sudden all this music is free, which of course it wasn't, but it just was because the technology allowed it to be. And I think the sense here that all of a sudden you have an access that's completely wild, that's a starting point that you can see in the film industry and in journalism as well, and we're talking the early 1990s, right? What happened in the film industry, I think, is that unlike journalism, for instance, they pursued this through litigation and through legal measures. I mean, they sued wherever they could sue. They went after Napster. They went after practically anybody they could. But at the same time, you saw that Tower Records in London closed down its last store. Virgin Records went away. Your various sort of street corner shops with CDs or vinyl, whatever, went away. These days, vinyl is coming back, but in a different function and different place in a way in the ecosystem. All of these things basically point to the power of technologies to completely eradicate a field. And I think what deserves attention when it comes to music is that in the music industry, they have been kind of forerunners on issues having to do with copyrights, issues having to do with ownership, and issues having to do with the future of artistry, of artists. And if you take, for instance, the question of artists, there you have one of the parallels to journalism. And I would even say that a journalist is a creative artist, but that's a different discussion. Some would disagree with that. But an artist, in the sense of being a musician, all of a sudden had a different sort of future scenario in the sense that the revenues from sales changed. At the same time, the access to new global arenas started to open up. So it has that kind of ambivalence to it. It has both of those sides. The same with journalism, I would say. So the early models of sort of online journalism in the 1990s, they kind of assumed that journalism was so important and the media was so important that they could open it up for free, and they did. And the basic assumption was that newspapers on print would still be there, and that would be the revenue. So journalism and the news media pursued the coming on these new technologies completely differently from the music industry. And I think that's also an interesting lesson to talk about in terms of what happens, as this moves forward, because eventually newspapers started to die. And you saw that particularly in countries like the United States, where the market function of newspapers is kind of the financial sort of center, the heart, if you will. If you don't have advertising, you don't have news. If you take local newspapers, regional newspapers, to the extent that you have national newspapers at all, that would probably be USA Today and possibly the New York Times, depends on how you define it. But they also were greatly affected by this, because there's no such thing as a paper newspaper being able to carry, the online. Gradually the online took over, and today it's the online that defines these news institutions. But the model that allowed for streaming services like Spotify, for instance, or Apple Music, which came late to the game, and they have been very successful, I think, in sort of catching up in a way. But Spotify, coming out of Sweden, I suppose, in some ways is a pretty particular story. It's actually a rather unique innovation story in the way that they thought out, what was happening here. So streaming, in a sense, becomes an answer to the illicit downloading, and subscribing to music becomes a new standard. So no longer do you go out and buy records and you have your bookshelves filled, with sort of all these CD. Vinyl things. You subscribe and you rent. So it's kind of comparable in a sense to, say, you take a city where the predominant way of living is renting an apartment, and you compare that to a city where the predominant way of living is owning your house. And that's actually a very interesting discussion to pursue as well, because it's a different relation to, the music if you rent it or you own it. Probably quite a few still keep downloading from Pirate Bay and other places. I wouldn't know, because I actually haven't been there for quite a few years. But what I do know is that when I build my sort of lists, and I have quite a few of those, something also rather profound happens in my relation to that music. And I can illustrate that if we have time. I can sort of put that sort of one stage further. I personally use 3 different services. And I use them because they're different. I use one service because it has the most, but it also has this knack for pushing things on me that annoy me. So when I get annoyed by these kinds of things, I move to the other one, which has sort of I think you might say, a different standard, because there are more videos. And I use that also, I'm a musician, so I use that because I need the videos. So I combine these two also by kind of like a third service that I keep, because a lot of the times when I sort of connect with other people in the music sort of field, I'm not a professional musician, but I'm somebody with more than an average sort of day to day, and I'm also quite involved with choirs, and we share files. So I have to be on that third service because everything is shared. That's the standard. That's Spotify. So in combination of these things, what happens is that I have sort of these underlying algorithms that I never think of, but they think of me. So it's kind of like they reveal new artists to me. They reveal people that I otherwise wouldn't have found. So thinking of going to, say, one of the better vinyl records stores that I can think of, which happens to be in Santa Cruz in California, that's advertising, I suppose. But anyway, it's going to spend it's going to be to compare like spending hours just sort of leafing through. And what happens on these services, I have that leafing through much closer to home, and whether I like it or not, it does that for me. And that's a profound change. If you were to take that and compare that also to journalism, you can see that the technology does the same. There are these algorithms that also tell me, like, that story came before this one, then you have that one, you have this one, they all connect to this one. And it pushes you to read rather differently than, say, if you have a broadsheet newspaper, you sit down at a cafeteria with a cup of coffee and you begin in the beginning. You might leave because there's like the story continues on page 7, and then so you go to page 7 and then you go back. But it's a very different way of reading, of also in interacting with your mediums. So those things I think are gradually dawning on us, that it's completely different. And for a very long time, I think what we saw was the access. Then negatively, we saw the financial catastrophe that it was, both for music and for journalism. But gradually, we're seeing that on a human level, the way that we approach and use these media, historically, it's putting us in a completely new place. It's like we've been going that way before, and all of a sudden, the direction goes like that. And the difference here is that all the access, all the abundance, that means that we choose, we select. And sometimes you would think that you're in charge of your selection. I highly doubt that. I think these technologies are much more in charge of our selection than we think about. And that for me also is a key explanation of what I pursue in my research, kind of the implications it has for polarization, for extremism, for sort of concentration of points of view in clusters of groups. And I think that's facilitated by technologies in ways that we, of course, have been discussing for quite some time, but I'm not quite sure we have any solution to it, because this is kind of part of the whole media literacy type of discussion. So I think if you look at it sort of from a bird's eye point of view, all of these things are connected, and we are just trying to sort them out. And I'm not quite sure that we have sorted them out, and I'm not quite sure that we are critical enough of sort of the futures here. Do we want that future? If we don't, what kind of possibility do we have to control and to mitigate that? A number of years ago, Steve Jobs had a keynote speech at Stanford University. That's all over the internet. It is considered one of the better ones that's been held there, and it's fascinating to see how a person like Steve Jobs became the kind of mythological figure that he did. I think he died, was it 2011 or something, something there. But I was living there and riding down on my bike from my house to Stanford University, and it's down the street. It's called University Avenue. And in what then used to be their headquarters of the Apple Store, it's the first Apple Store outside of the Apple computer sort of campus, and that's on University Avenue in Palo Alto. And I was actually going in to buy a USB cord, but the store was closed. And picture like the front of the store completely covered with Post-it stickers, yellow, blue, pink, whatever they are, the colors. And I have some photos of that because I stopped to read them when I was going past there. And the occasion here was the store was closed because the personnel of the store were at the campus in Cupertino to commemorate the Steve Jobs' death. So the entire store was closed that day. But there's one of these stickers, and it reads the following: "Thank you, Steve, for opening up the world." Now, a lot of us would say that what happens with the iPhone, what happened actually with the iPod before that, and the access to music, that combination of hardware and sort of software and content that kind of defines the success of the Apple sort of company, that actually is a gigantic step ahead for mankind in that it opens the world. But I think you can flip that. Because in many ways, what Steve Jobs did was close the world. And I think that sort of paradox in whatever opens something closes something else. And I'm not so sure that I'm correct with saying this, but I think that in one way we have been sort of allowed an imaginative, global sort of road trip constantly, all the time, day in and day out. You go on Airbnb, you go on TripAdvisor, you use Google Maps, whatever you do, you always have these sort of global things in your hand with your smartphone. But on the other hand, I think maybe what also happens is that it closes your sort of imagination to the closer things at home, at heart. It makes you stop thinking about the birds singing. It makes you stop thinking maybe about sort of personal relations in your family because you have the entire world in your hands in a way. So there, I think we need to start thinking that something can be both good and bad at the same time. And these technologies, they have that capacity for doing enormously good and also enormously bad things. And that kind of explains my academic interest in the field.
But something that reminded me right now, we started the talk about the whole world as on a global level and about America, but you told me also that you had an experience of working in Africa. And I think when we are speaking about the birds that are singing and the nature and everything, that you can make a parallel how the things are working there, because we know here in European Union and Scandinavia and all across the Europe the things are very similar, and we are on this western side and influence of the America and all of those gadgets from the Apple and other companies. But how the things are there? What was your experience in that side of the world? We have 7-8 more minutes of the podcast, so maybe you can tell me a little bit about that. I think it will be very interesting for our viewers.
So there are two ways I could look at that are relevant to my own experience. One of them is that having lived and worked in a very information-rich context, both Norway and the United States would fit into that. We kind of assume things. We tend to take certain things for granted. And I do too. I mean, I'm guilty of that all the time, and I'm kind of pursuing the uses of technologies and technology as a phenomenon in journalism, in creative arts, without sometimes stopping up to really feel what it's like when those technologies are not there. You can sort of play the mind game and looking back in time, say 10, 15, 20 years, and try to reimagine what it was like when we had VCRs and we had, well, actually before mobile phones or whatever. But I think the other way of looking at this is that if you encounter contexts or places, situations where these technologies have never been, and you try to imagine what they do to contexts where whatever assumption I might have, a stereotype I might have, they're leapfrogging in a sense over generations of sort of change that we have spent a lot of time on. Or to put it this way, in my country, I think we've had telegraph, we have had wireless and cable, we have had moving sound, we got the radio in the 1920s, television in the 1950s, and so on and so forth. But if I go to one of those particular two countries that I've spent the most time in, which would be Ethiopia, they've never had it. And all of a sudden they have the internet. You know, all of a sudden your average student will have a smartphone. I mean, cell phones are expensive, but they have them. They don't have the landline telephone experience that we grew up with before that went away. They don't have the expanding television culture that we have, in the sense of having sort of local documentaries, local entertainment, and local news developed. They have a situation where on the one hand they're used to getting their news from Uganda or Kenya via London and Reuters. It kind of loops up and back down. On the other hand, they are also making smart use of these technologies and catching up. But there is a huge difference, and there is, I think, kind of a situation there that for me is also a little bit difficult to describe unless I have 2 hours, because those details you really have to feel, in a sense, to get there. The first time I came to teach, it's a long time ago, and the University of Addis Ababa has a communication department on the 5th floor in a building. And even the city is like 2,500 meters above sea level, so it's thin air. And the first thing I remember was that it was actually difficult to breathe once you go up the stairs. I had to stop on level 4 before I got all the way to the top. And it's an apt metaphor, because the sense of thin air and the sense of having a hard time breathing, I think in a cultural sense is also what happens when these media changes, in a sense, come too fast. It's like you're at an altitude where it actually isn't so easy to navigate because your system is not geared for it. I was teaching journalism. I was teaching journalism and democracy. I was teaching freedom of speech. And I think the general assumption behind that, you can always sort of stop and think about, but the general assumption is that freedom of speech is a good thing. You and I would agree that freedom of speech is a good thing. But on the other hand, there is a limit to where freedom of speech is not necessarily a good thing without any kind of a context. It depends, you know. And I think also when we teach media and democracy, we tend to have a certain set assumption of what democracy is. Well, Ethiopia is a very proud country. It's a country that has a long history of independence, not that much history in terms of colonialism, just a few years with Italian presence. But at the same time, it's a country ridden by ethnic sort of dynamics. And what you've been seeing since 2019, maybe about 2019, is sort of the gradual unraveling of the bonds that kept them together. And I think there is more than coincidental relation here to the coming of various news media that allow communities not necessarily to build a television station, but to do TV-like things on YouTube. You know, it's cheaper in a sense. You have access in ways that you didn't before. Now, there's an interesting connection here also to our general assumption that more information is good. I think sometimes we have to stop and say that more information also can be too much information, and over-connection can be an issue. But those things, for me, it's essentially sort of illustrated by the question I always ask before I go down: Are we good with the internet? I'm coming next week. We're going to be talking. I'm going to be teaching. I've been teaching in northern Ethiopia. I've been teaching in Uganda, and I think the main problem isn't really whether we have the internet, but it's whether we have 1 or 2 or 7 stops in energy and sort of the electricity. So all of a sudden, it's not necessarily that you don't have internet; it's you don't have light. It's fundamental. It goes actually kind of deep. And I think that we generally have too little appreciation for the enormity of that difference between those who have these technologies and those who don't. And it kind of takes me back to what I was studying in Minneapolis for my PhD in international communication. This has been a huge issue in UNESCO for decades. And we think maybe that today's sort of ubiquitous sort of presence of telephones and media kind of alleviates these differences. I'm not so sure they do. I think at the deeper level here, those differences tend to get bigger, not smaller. And I'm thinking that more than ever, maybe we need to think about these things, because now with the coming of artificial intelligence, we are at a new stage that qualitatively reformulate how we use technologies. But I think some of the questions of distribution, of inclusion, of exclusion are exactly the same.
There are so many more themes that I would like to talk with you, but our time is slowly getting out, so I will have to say a big thank you for you.
Thank you for having me.
I wish you have a nice time here in Dubrovnik. It was very nice for me to learn something from you, to hear about the worldwide experience. And I'm lucky that I had you as a guest here in Dubrovnik.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. So,
thank you.
Thank you.
Poštovani gledatelji UNIDU televizije, također i slušatelji UNIDU radija, još jedan podcast DU-CHECK ciklusa je za nama. Profesor Oddgeir Tveiten iz Norveške bio je današnji gost. Puno toga smo čuli, svakako u narednim epizodama se družimo sa drugim znanstvenicima, profesorima, studentima, uglednim ljudima iz polja medija, odnosa s javnošću, političke znanosti, komunikologije, tako ostanite uz nas.